Here is a purple ink by Taccia Murasaki.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
As a note, the audio I had a little bit of an issue with, so the sound of the pen writing is not going to be as good. Also, I am aware that I wrote the wrong manufacturer on the top of the name of this swatch. So it's just something to be aware of. I know. Whoopsie. This is a very blue leaning as a purple. A little too blue leaning for me, though it does show a very purple in the right pen. There is some tone variation by pen and sometimes looks like a very different color as a result of your pen choice. It can shade, but sadly, the best shading happens as it's looking more blue than purple. It's a nice enough ink that I myself don't see using a bunch. It just doesn't scratch that itch for me as a purple.
The pen for today is a Pilot Vanishing Point. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine, this is certainly the bluer side of some of this in how it looks. Now, it's not feathering and it's not spreading. It does shade a little bit. You see it in the H of what? In the first line, where it starts a little lighter, gets darker at the H, lightens up at the A and T. There's a little bit that comes through, just not really tons and not in any kind of a standout way here. Looking at the wet fine, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine nib, and it is at its best tone to me right here in what I'm seeing, in that it's very dark. Now, there's no feathering and no spread, and there's really no shading, but it is the most purple this ink gets from this wet fine. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread. It's not lighter to the point that it's looking blue. It's still kind of looking purple, and it's shading really well. I think it's doing a really good job here. You see, he starts darker, gets lighter. Had goes from dark to light to dark. And the next had dark to light to dark. It really shades very well this entire time. I really do enjoy how dark it gets in the shading next to the more normal tone that's going on, the more regular tone that's going on. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than we had with the medium. It does not feather. It does not spread. It is shading. I'm seeing the purple, and I'm really seeing the blue lean in this, and it's shading very well. And the thing is, as we see some of the blue lean, we get more of the shading. It's really a shame. I don't think this is bad. I don't think this is a color I run to. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 8 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairefontaine and a little more blue leaning here. Now, it shows up without any feathering, without any spread, and with almost no shading. There's a couple of spots where shading kind of comes through. You see it a little bit in William on the third line, or have and it on the second line, but not really very much. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a lot darker than it was with the soft fine. A little bit lighter than we had on the Clairefontaine. Little dustier looking a tone as a result of the paper. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade. I think the little bit lighter, dustier tone we're getting makes actually the tone look even better here than it did on the Clairefontaine. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than we had with the wet fine nib. It is very, very close to the tone we had on the Clairefontaine, just a smidgen lighter. There's no feather, there's no spread, there's only a couple moments that shading shows up. You see it on the D of and on the H of that, but not a whole lot. You see it a little bit on the B of Bert, not tons. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. It is a little lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. It is a little more blue leaning than it was on the Clairefontaine. Now, it has no feathering, it has no spread, it has no shading. It's a shame how it's looking on this paper, and I do like this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you do see the ink gets fairly deep in there, but nothing bleeds through touching the page underneath. And with that, it does have quite a bit of ghosting where you see it deeper, not on the soft fine at all. So using the back of the page entirely has to do with which pen you choose to use.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little darker than it was on the Clairefontaine, a little more purple looking. This is the best of the soft fine in tone that we're going to get here. The tone of the paper is affecting the ink enough to really make it a much nicer looking purple. Now, there's no feather, there's no spread, there's a little more shading here than there was on the Clairefontaine. You get to see mostly mid-tone and then some darker tones in just about any word you choose, making it a better performer. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. A bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, a very dark purple to look at. Like, there's no mistaking looking at it as anything other than a purple, but it is very dark. No feathering, no spread, no shading. I wish it just had a little something more. I don't know what it's missing right there, but it's missing a something. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. I think this is the nicest general tone we get. I wish it shaded with it, and I wish it shaded to that very dark purple here, but it's just not doing it. If it was giving me this tone with the shading to very dark, it would be really spot on. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone as the medium. Little bit lighter, I think, than the Clairfontaine. Now, we do get a little bit of feathering that's going on. You see it in them on the first line, that on the second line, them on the third line, Mead on the third line, and on the second. There's a lot of it. It's feathering. It's not going really well here. There's almost no spread. A tiny bit of spread is occurring, but almost none. It's not really the spread that's the problem. It's the feathering here that's the problem. Now, we get no shading. We do get disappointment looking at this ink on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, this spot that is circled did spot the page underneath just a little bit, but that could have been me. That could have been the paper or ink, no idea, but that spot came through. Other than that, we have very little, almost nothing for ghosting. You could write back here, and only that one spot bled through to the page underneath, so I'll use it.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is right about the same darkness as it was on the Clairfontaine. Slightly more of the blue undertone is showing through here. No feather, no spread. It shades at right about the same level as it did on the Clairfontaine, but the tone of what we're getting is slightly different, slightly more blue leaning. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread. It is shading, which it really didn't do on the Clairfontaine. But if you look on round, third line, the word round, compared to body on the second line or his on the second line, you see there is some tone variation through some of the writing. Not so much shading, but change in tone as you write. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, a little more of the blue undertones showing through. No feather, no spread. It shades a little bit, just a little bit, but not really a whole lot. This is why I stand by how different Clairfontaine is from Rhodia. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit, just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium nib, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. It shades a little bit, only a few spots you can find, not shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Krishna Orchid Lily. Here is Noodler's Concord Bream. Here is Private Reserve Fast Dry Tanzanite. Here is TWSBI 1791 Royal Purple. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. And here it's really a little bit more of a purple, a little better of a purple than it was on the Clairefontaine. Very strange. Normally this kind of mutes some of those tones. Really, I think did a better job for it. No feather, no spread, shades just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, showing why more people should look at these notebooks. Looking at the wet fine nib, quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading coming through here. Look at dwarves on the second line, uncooked, Bert and Bill stopped. It's there. It's shading. This is a great, right here we've found the match with this, because otherwise I'm rather disappointed with the ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tad bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, and dustier as a purple tone. I think the purple is showing much nicer here than it did on the Clairefontaine, really with all of the nibs. No feathering, no spread, only a tiny bit of shading does happen. You do get to find some darker letters from time to time, but not like it's shading in a way where you're going to say this is a shader. Just, it happens almost like on accident. Looking at the broad nib, it is just about the same tone that we have with the medium, quite a bit lighter than we have on the Clairefontaine, dustier as a tone than the Clairefontaine. No feathering, no spread, no shading. The only spots that look darker are commas, quotes, periods, things like that. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get almost no ghosting, and we get nothing that bleeds through and touches the page underneath.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a green ink by Pilot Mixable Green. Here is a gray ink by Levenger Smoky. Here is a pink ink by Sailor Dancer Pink. Here is a yellow ink by Diatramentis Emma Goldman Gold. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does feather a tiny bit. It does spread a tiny bit. Neither the feathering or the spread that are occurring here, anything that should be a concern for you if you want to use copy paper. And I don't think you're actually losing much for performance with the soft fine on copy paper as compared to Clairefontaine. Looking at the wet fine nib, quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, and it's not nearly as purple as it was on the Clairefontaine, though it is much lighter than it was there. Yes, feathers. Yes, spreads. Spreads between a medium and a broad. I guess you can say there's spots that shade. I mean, the word sax on the second line has a little bit of shading in it. The word light on the first line has a little shading in it. I'll say it's shading, which is a good thing in general, not always for copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine nib. It is right about the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Feathering, yes. Spread, yes. Shading, no. Now, as far as the feathering, it's fairly consistent all over, but it matches with the spread. It's going a bit thicker than a broad here from this medium. I think if you write larger and you write fast, you've got a good combination, a decent color on the page that you may not hate. It's not that I hate this color, but I don't think you would hate using it. I don't think it's the end of the world what we're seeing right here. Looking at the broad nib, right about the same tone, maybe just a tad bit darker than it was with the medium. Little bit lighter than what we have on the Clairfontaine. Now, of course, it feathers. Not as bad as the medium, but there is little bits of feathering. You see it on growled, you see it on surprise, and on pop. It's there. Or growled, gnarled. No, gnarled. The spread is getting me here. My penmanship's not great, but this is making it harder to read. And it doesn't shade. Looking at the back of the page, you see there's a lot of ghosting. You're not writing back here, but none of it bled through and touched the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
A medium flow broad seems to shade best in some of what I've seen away from the review in writing, but also looks the most blue, unfortunately. The darker tones from a wet fine or wet medium are the most purple I got, and what I would really go for when I look at this. Though any nib, as long as it's a very wet pen, might be a really good choice.
This is the end, and thanks for watching.